Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive into the content of today's episode, I want to let you know about a free webinar that I am offering coming up. If you are listening to this episode the day it drops, which is Tuesday, November 12th, the webinar is coming up this weekend. So if you're listening to it anytime within the first few days of this podcast airing, I am offering a free Principles of Strength Training for Dancers webinar on Sunday, November 17th. It's at 10 a.m. Pacific time, so that's Vancouver or like Los Angeles time zone, which is 1 p.m. Eastern time. And I would love to have all of you join me. It is completely free, no strings attached. It's just information that I really feel like I want to get out to the dance world and ties in directly to the content of today's podcast episode as well. So a lot of what I am going to chat about today might be a little bit similar to what we're going to cover in the webinar. But in the webinar, just because it's a different platform, I'm going to have a chance to go into that information in a lot more detail and have visuals for you and more examples and all of that kind of thing. So still listen to today's episode, and if you are interested in learning more about the specifics around principles of strength training, then I would love to have you join me for the webinar on November 17th. I will drop the sign-up link in the show notes for this episode, or you can head to my Instagram, which is Dance Physio Erika, or to my website, which is allegroperformance.com, and there are links to sign up for the webinar in both of those places as well. All right, on to today's podcast episode, which is all about strength training for dancers. So this is a topic that I've been wanting to cover for a long time, and have touched on it briefly in lots of other podcast episodes. And specifically, one that we probably talked about it the most on was one of the earlier podcast episodes. It was episode 7, I believe. Yeah, episode 7, that was all about dance conditioning and the difference between cross-training versus supplementary training. In that episode, I really got into the differences between like what constitutes cross-training and how that is different from supplementary training, but I didn't specifically dive into a lot of the details or the specifics with regards to strength training for dancers. And this is a topic that has been talked about a lot in recent years, is gaining more awareness, more traction, and it's something I feel like we need to dive into just a little bit more, because there are still a lot of misconceptions about strength training in general, but also for dancers. And there's also maybe not necessarily a great understanding within the dance community of how to actually implement strength training, or what strength training should look like or might look like for dancers. So that is what we're going to dive into today. So it is no surprise to anyone who listens to this podcast that the physical demands of dance are increasing and have increased exponentially over the past 10, 20, 30 years. The physical feats that dancers are now performing, and often at younger ages, are absolutely incredible, but our dance training practices have not necessarily adapted to keep pace with that. So if you go into, a ballet class or even a jazz class or just any studio class, realistically, it is not going to look fundamentally different most of the time than what a class would have looked like 25, 30 years ago. Ballet class structure is still very similar. Everything we're training in terms of like the actual dance specific training really has not adapted all that much, although the physical demands of dance have increased exponentially. So we're doing our dancers a disservice by not adapting our training practices to actually prepare them for these new physical demands and the demands of performance that they are facing. And I think historically or traditionally, it was assumed that dance class alone was enough to be able to train a dancer for their performance demands. And that was maybe actually accurate 50 years ago or even 30 years ago. Maybe you didn't need to be preparing your body in other ways outside of a structured dance class environment. It is possible that class was adequate for what those performance demands were. But that is no longer the case. And we know from research now, and they've actually studied this and looked at this, that dance class alone does not actually prepare dancers for the demands of performance. And whether that comes from a cardiovascular perspective, so dancers don't actually have the cardiovascular capacity to meet performance demands from just training in dance classes alone, or what we're going to talk about today when it comes to actually muscular strength or strength training principles, we do not elicit enough of a physiological response to actually gain strength from dance class alone. And there's probably a few different reasons for this, and one that I will dive into a little bit today is one of the main principles of strength training, which is the principle of overload. So before I get into actually defining what that principle of overload or what overload actually means I think it's important for us to have a base understanding of what we mean when we're talking about strength training, because people throw this term around in contexts that are maybe potentially not accurate, or what they are actually doing or performing is maybe not actually strength training. So there's probably loads of different definitions, but at the most basic level, strength training is performance of physical exercise or physical activity that is designed to improve muscular strength by progressively increasing the force output of the muscles. And this can be accomplished in different ways, and it is oftentimes done through weight training, so adding external resistance or external load that is gradually or progressively increasing the force output of the muscles. It can be done with body weight exercises, potentially. We'll talk about that more in a second. It can be done with what are called isometric exercises. So that is when we contract a muscle, but there's not actually movement happening through the muscle. So the muscle's staying in a static position, but we're just tensing up the muscle or contracting the muscle. And it can happen with other movements or activities, things like plyometrics and stuff like that. So the key with this definition of strength training is this idea of progressively increasing the force output or the force demands of these muscles. So the principle of overload ties really closely to this definition of strength training, because the principle of overload sort of states that in order for us to progress and to improve, and in this case it is our muscular strength we're thinking about or talking about, in order for us to improve that, we need to be exposed to stress beyond what is normal for the body. The way the body adapts is by responding and responding to stresses placed on the body. And we've talked about this before, again, on previous episodes, when we've talked about tendon loading, for instance, or stress responses like stress fractures and things like that in dancers. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, we do talk about this kind of principle a little bit, in that the body adapts to the loads that are placed on it. And if we want to think about building muscular strength, we want the body to be able to progressively adapt to these increased loads that we are placing on it. And so, there's different ways that we can do that with this sort of overload principle. We often use an acronym called FIT, which is frequency, intensity, time, or type. So we can manipulate any of those variables. So how often we're doing something, the intensity with which we're doing it at, how long we're doing something for, or the tempo or speed we're doing something at, and then the type of exercise or the type of loading. So we can manipulate this overload principle in order to get the strength outputs that we want. But when we come back to what I was initially saying, that dance class alone is often not enough to elicit a physiological response to, build progressive strength in muscles, it is often because dance class does not vary enough, or we don't get that progressive increase in stimulus. So when we're doing dance class, so say we're doing, a ballet class, for instance, it's just an easy one to use as an example because of the way it's structured. That ballet class isn't necessarily always overloading that person's body. So we're not always progressively stimulating the muscles in a physiological way to continually gain strength. Now, that's not to say that a ballet class is never going to provide strength gains for any dancer, because it absolutely will. And if we have, for instance, an adult who is new to dance, who their previous level of activity was fairly sedentary, so maybe they have some sort of a desk job or something, and they've decided, you know what, I want to start exercising more, I'm going to join a ballet class. And so they start participating in a ballet class, maybe once a week, maybe twice a week. They will likely increase their muscle strength because their baseline levels are fairly low to start with if they have previously been fairly sedentary. So that stimulus is likely enough to elicit strength responses in that individual. However, that is not usually who we're talking about or the dancers that we are working with on a more consistent basis. The dancers that we tend to interact with more are dancers who are dancing at a competitive level or an advanced vocational level or pre-professional level, or even our professional dancers. And those dancers have probably been doing ballet class since they were 6 years old, 8 years old, maybe 12 years old if they started a little bit late. And so if we look at them 5, 10, 15 years into their journey of dance, those classes likely no longer provide a sufficient response to actually elicit these strength gains that we want to see, unless the class is being designed in a really intentional way to do that. But that's not usually what we see in more traditional dance classes like a ballet class or something like that. Occasionally we will see teachers design, maybe a warm-up component of some sort of a tech class or something where they're really intentionally trying to build up muscular strength. And so in those cases, maybe we do see that. But just in general, and what the research shows us is that dance class alone is not enough to, elicit this physiological response that we want and need to gain muscle strength. So why do we want to gain muscle strength? Do dancers truly need more muscle strength? Well, yes, they do, from what the research shows us. And one of the reasons, like I was saying before, is the physical demands of dance have just increased so much. And so for dancers to actually just be able to participate in and complete the choreography and meet choreographic demands, they do often need more physical strength than maybe what they are getting in class or where they're currently at. And we also know that strength is protective against injury. So when we're looking at anything when it comes to injury prevention, we want our dancers to be as strong as possible. And stronger dancers are more resilient and they are less likely to get injured. So strength training is something that, from a, medical or like a health and wellness perspective, it's something that we know that dancers should be doing, but it's often something that dancers are not incorporating into their training programs. And I think there are a variety of different reasons why maybe strength training is not more prevalent in the dance world. And I will say it's gaining more acceptance, it's gaining more prevalence. Like slowly we start to see that shift. But when we look at the dance industry and the dance community as a whole, it is still massively lacking strength training opportunities for dancers. The vast majority of dancers are not participating in any sort of like formal, structured, like well-planned, well-thought-out strength training program. And I think, like I said, that there is a variety of reasons why there's been reluctance in the dance world to adapt strength training. There are certainly were or probably still are some like preconceived notions that are likely false, but that still permeate within the dance world. And the number one thing that you still hear or see or dancers will like say as their reason for not participating in strength training is the fear of getting too quote unquote bulky or having their muscles bulk up and changes that may happen to their physique as a result of strength training. And I will say that, and anybody in the strength and conditioning world will also tell you that most of changes that we see or physique that we see in people is determined by genetics. And so simply adding strength training to your conditioning programs or to your dance training program is not going to turn you into a super muscly bodybuilder type body physique. The people who do have those physiques and people competing in, say, like bodybuilding competitions and things like that, they have to work so incredibly hard, and not just on weightlifting, but like with regards to diet and other exercise they're doing and everything. They work so hard to attain that physique. It is so difficult to get to those levels of like bulkiness in muscles. So for the average person, that is not going to happen with basic strength training. You're not going to be training in a way that is going to lead to those types of physique changes that, a lot of dancers, that is sort of something they'll talk about fearing, and it is their reason for not necessarily wanting to participate in strength training. I think there was also a perception or a fear around dancers getting injured if they participate in strength training activities. And that's probably a more real or like, what's the word I'm looking for? We'll just go with real, a more real fear in terms of, or like reasonable fear, because if somebody is participating in strength training programs in, an unsupervised way, or it's maybe not well planned out or not like well thought out, there is potential for increased risk of injury because we need to balance our strength training programs with our dance training programs. And so when we look at overall loading and periodization and all of those concepts that we've talked about lots on this podcast before, we do need to be mindful of that. But if a dancer is participating in a well-planned and sort of structured strength training program, then we actually know that it is going to be protective against injuries rather than lead to increased risk of injuries. So it's kind of one of those things that it's like not all strength training is created equal, but if we're doing good strength training programs, they're going to be protective against injury. And then I also think that there has been a perception for years, and again, probably more prevalent in the ballet world than in other dance genres potentially, but that it was only the boys who need to do the strength training. So if they're doing the lifting or they're doing partnering or things like that, they're the ones who need to participate in strength training activities, but girls don't need to. And if anybody has watched any sort of dance recently, you will know that the physical demands of what female dancers are doing exceeds, if not matches, what the male dancers are doing. And when we look at especially contemporary genres or modern or anything like that, there's a lot of, lifting and partnering and things like that that are going on with the female dancers now as well. So we know that all dancers need to be working on strength training, not just male dancers. So that's kind of one that, again, historically, maybe there's been this kind of idea that it should only be boys doing it, but really it should be all dancers. Interestingly, there was a study that came out in, I believe it was 2001, Claire Farmer published a study looking at like the perceptions of strength training in the dance community. So it was like a survey that was sent out to dancers and dance teachers and stuff, and kind of just asked about some of these things, like the perception of why dancers may or may not participate in strength training or what their perceptions of strength training were. And interestingly enough, some of these kind of like reluctances or myths or whatever you want to call them were a lot less prevalent among the dancers who filled out the surveys than maybe the researchers thought might be there, or maybe historically we would have assumed. But the interesting thing that I found from that study, I mean, there's lots of interesting things about it, but one of the biggest kind of takeaways is that a lot of these, maybe historical assumptions or whatever we want to call them are still more prevalent in the dance teachers who responded to that survey. So dancers themselves seem to be embracing the idea of strength training and have less sort of negative perceptions or negative connotations associated with strength training, but there was still more reluctance within the teaching community to embrace strength training. And I find that really, really interesting. And I don't know that this study kind of dove into or didn't actually have the opportunity to look at like why that is the case potentially. But I do think that maybe some of teachers' reluctance to embrace it. I mean, partly they would have been dancers who grew up dancing in generations before. And so there's more of that ingrained historical, traditional aspect of their experience within the dance world. But I also wonder if maybe some of their hesitation with embracing strength training comes from a bit of like an uncertainty about how to implement it, what it looks like, what strength training actually entails for their dancers. And so rather than, feeling unsure or feeling inadequate in that regard, they just kind of don't embrace that part of dance training for dancers. So I have no idea. This is just me speculating. But it is also one of the reasons why I wanted to offer this webinar, to give people tools to be able to start to implement strength training in a way that is more thought out and more well planned than maybe what we have historically seen. And so the webinar is definitely geared towards dance teachers, although the information is absolutely applicable to dancers themselves as well. If you just want to know like what should my strength training program look like? What are the principles of strength training? How do we implement it in a dance setting? All of those types of things. So like I said, I think within dancers themselves, there is definitely increased acceptance around strength training and a recognition that it should be a part of their training program. A lot of the sort of, I'm going to call them emerging professionals, so sort of newly professional dancers, people that have graduated from high school. Maybe they're in their first few years as like a freelance dancer or in some sort of like a junior company or training program. A lot of them come into the clinic and are like, okay, I think I need to like work on strengthening, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know what that looks like. I've never been to the gym before. Like, can you help me with a strength training program? And so a lot of the dancers recognize the need for it, but don't necessarily know where to get started. And even in studios that are trying to implement strength training programs, they don't always end up being as effective as what they potentially could be because of sort of how they're being implemented or what they look like in terms of training. And so a lot of programming that I see happening within a studio setting is maybe insufficient to, again, elicit these strength responses that we want. And so we'll see studios that have, put we'll call it like a strength and conditioning class or a stretch and strength class or whatever they want to call it onto their studio schedule, which is amazing. I love to see studios that have like put that on the schedule. It shows that they know the importance and they're trying to like, convey that information to their dancers and say, it's important for us to have this as part of your schedule. But when you actually go in and look at what it is they're doing in class, it is often not enough to be, again, eliciting these responses within dancers. And some of that can be constraints within the studio setting, like maybe there is not equipment available, so they're relying entirely on body weight exercises. But a lot of the times it's that I think the programming is too similar from week to week. So it comes back to the same idea of us doing like a ballet class where it's kind of the same stimulus that's being placed on the body week to week. And then you come into the conditioning class and again, it looks the same. It almost looks like this prescribed class. So although there might not be anything wrong with the exercises they're doing, like maybe they're incorporating some squats and maybe they're incorporating some, I don't know if it's body weight stuff like planks or push-ups or things like that. If those exercises are the same week to week to week to week, we're never eliciting that overload principle in these dancers' bodies. So we're potentially not actually seeing the strength improvements that we want. So we need to be able to, again, understand the principles behind building a strength program. And then those variables, some of which I talked about, like that, FIT principle, frequency, intensity, time, type, we need to be able to manipulate those in a way that our body is getting novel stimulus so that it is responding and adapting to that. And that's not to say that it has to be like completely brand new exercises every single time we do it, But we do need to think about, okay, which variables are we manipulating? How is this being, how are these dancers being overloaded? And in a lot of instances, we actually do need dancers to be exposed to external load. So 2 weights, ideally. Resistance bands may or may not provide enough external load. If you have a group of really young dancers who are, just physically not as strong and haven't done any strength training in the past, then maybe resistance bands are adequate. But when we're looking at pre-professional and professional dancers, that's generally not enough stimulus to provide an overload in their body. We often need to load them with more external load. So whether that is barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells, like whatever it is. And this can be challenging because most dance studios do not have, access to those within a studio setting. And so then it becomes a question of, okay, how do we facilitate our dancers accessing this? Do we pair with, a gym in the community or a personal trainer who maybe knows a bit about dance conditioning or things like that? Like, how can we think a little bit outside the box to be able to design programs that are going to provide appropriate strength training for our dancers? The other thing that I see with these strength and conditioning programs implemented in a studio setting that maybe, again, doesn't provide us with just like true strength gains or true strength training, that's hard to say, is that oftentimes the exercises that are being done are way too complex or sometimes too advanced for the dancer. So again, if we have young dancers who haven't done any sort of strength training in the past, it's sometimes really difficult for them to even master a basic squat pattern. And so then if we start making these exercises like super complex or more advanced, and so we want them to do like single leg squats, and then they're, I don't even know, like I'm not coming up with good examples right now, but we'll sometimes see things that are too complex for them to be able to master the foundational movement skill, and therefore they're not necessarily training what we think they are training. So in that case, does it make it a bad exercise? Maybe not. It might be a totally fine exercise if we're looking at more neuromuscular control, or maybe we're looking at more like reaction time of muscles or things like that. Like there's different things that we can be targeting within a conditioning class. But if we're looking at purely strength, we're just interested in strength training or strength gains in these muscles, oftentimes the movements that dancers are performing are too complex or too advanced for them. And so when we're looking at strength training, it doesn't need to be super complicated. It can be very basic in terms of movement patterns we're looking at, but we want to be able to then progressively load those patterns. So we don't need to add 7 million variations to a lunge or a squat or a deadlift or whatever the movement pattern is, but we do need to be able to progressively load that. And what I often see happening in a dance studio setting, and again, I think there's reasons for this because of the constraints of studio space and equipment and things like that, is rather than focusing on those fundamental movement patterns and then trying to load them, what we see is complexity being added to those movement patterns. And when that happens, again, I don't think we're truly then training strength. I think we're training, like I said, all these other things like neuromuscular control and things like that. So that's just something to think about when we are implementing strength programs. And again, I fully recognize that it is challenging in a studio setting, but I do think there is an opportunity for dance studios and dance companies to think a little bit outside the box to come up with ways to expose and introduce your dancers to this. And maybe it means investing in a little bit of equipment and having, a class set of dumbbells or whatever it ends up being. Or maybe it means, like I said, partnering with a gym or a trainer or something that is close by, that is local, where you can set up some sort of a program where they're working with somebody external who's working on that sort of like strengthening part of things. So I know it's not a super easy quick fix where it's just like, oh, we'll just throw this into their training program and that will be, the solution to it all. But I do think there's room to improve on what is currently happening in the dance world, which in a lot of cases is nothing when it comes to the strength idea. The last thing I will say about this, just because I do want to wrap up, is We also need to consider our principles of periodization anytime we're thinking about strength training with dancers. And so if you have listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know that periodization is one of my favorite things to talk about. And we already know that dancers are exposed to really high training loads and are potentially susceptible to injury based on these training loads. So just trying to overload their body, outside of the studio or in like a strength capacity isn't necessarily the best idea, because we might be pushing that dancer, into a place where they're actually even more overloaded and more susceptible to injury. So strength training needs to be planned out in conjunction with their dance training. And when we talk about periodization, it's this idea of like having seasonality within our training schedule. And one of the reasons why seasonality is so important is so that we have time where we can like prioritize and periodize this information. And so, for example, if dancers have an off season, which most dancers don't right now, but if we can embrace that idea of like implementing an off season, then that is really the time where dancers should be working on building up their muscular strength and really building a really solid foundation of strength going into the season. That isn't dance-specific strength. It's like functional movement patterns, just like general I'm a human being strength. And then when we get into the in-season part of the season, or when they're in like a more busy competition time or show, like Nutcrackers are coming up soon and that type of thing, then we pull back on the strength training and we go into a more maintenance phase, and the dance training side of things like ramps up. And so we cannot have our dancers be overloading their bodies and going like full tilt 100% of the time. So although yes, it is super important for our dancers to implement and be incorporating strength training into their programming, we need to do it in a thoughtful way, and we need to do it in a way that kind of like embraces and encourages that periodization in order to be successful at this. So it's just something else to think about, because I think a lot of people get really gung-ho and they're like, all right, we're going to go and we're going to implement strength training. We know it's going to be incredible for our dancers. And then they just go and like burn out their dancers by adding all of this loading in a time of the season where the dancers are already doing high levels of loading. So we really need to be thinking ahead and planning ahead and really trying to plan our training around what that season for that dancer looks like. So going and trying to increase your strength right at the same time competitions are starting is too late. You needed to be doing that 3 months or 6 months prior. So we do need to really be thinking in terms of seasonality and periodization. So I'm going to wrap things up there. I hope that that was helpful for you in terms of just understanding a little bit more about strength training and how we can maybe utilize some of the principles of it a little bit better to implement it into a dance studio setting. And like I said, I am offering this free Principles of Strength Training webinar where I'm going to dive way more into the actual like principles and how we can adapt them and what that actually might look like in terms of programming for strength training. I'm not going to get into specific, like this is the strength workout that a dancer should do, because that's really individual. But in terms of just really understanding it and being able to then apply it to your own specific dance setting. So that is happening on Sunday, November 17th. There will be a replay available if you are not able to attend live. So if you know that it doesn't work for you time zone wise or whatever, sign up anyway. The recording will be sent to you and you can watch it whenever it works for you. And if you are listening to this podcast episode after November 17th, head to www.allegroperformance.com, the website, and I will have a link somewhere on the website under the education resources to the replay of the webinar as well. Once again, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your support, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.